Well, kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea. As you know from last webinar with Sophie Henford, some of you might know me. For some of you, I might be a new person. And I work with the policy team at the PSA, and I'm your host today for this webinar with Max Rashbrooke, who is joining us today. Hi, Max.
Hi, Andrea.
Awesome. And this webinar today is actually co-hosted with the Fabian Society. So a big shout out to them. Thank you very much. Also for sharing with many people, and you are joining us as I speak. So that's wonderful. You might know that this is part of a series of webinars that we are doing from now until September to discuss a number of chapters that we are going to publish in a book called Progressive Thinking, the Future of Our Public and Community Services. And for those very keen followers of the PSA and members of the PSA, you will know that it's part of a series of books that we have done in the past. And we have done a book on tax, on housing, and also on the future of work. So if you're interested in those topics, have a look around on our website. You will find the versions there. And this book will be published sometime later this year. Because of COVID, we couldn't obviously publish as we did in the past. So we are publishing our chapters as they come in, and you can also find them on our website and on the Facebook page. And instead of doing lunchtime seminars to engage with our thinkers, we are doing webinars instead. And thank you all for joining us and for coming along to this one. We will be running this webinar as we did last time. Since we have a few new participants on board, I will quickly run through the logistics of the webinar. So we will start with a bit of an introduction of Max, and then Max will give us an overview of his chapter that he drafted, and we will then start a conversation for about maybe a good 20-25 minutes, where you will have the opportunity to ask questions as well. And please use the question and answer function on the bottom there of your Zoom screen. Please don't post the questions into the chat function. You can happily chat along during the seminar or webinar, but use the question and answer function, please, for your question. It allows other people to like your question as well, and gives a bit of an indication of what most people are interested in. So that would be fabulous. Yeah, and I think we can probably get started. So as you can see, we have Max Rashbrooke here today, the 2020 JD Stout Fellow at Victoria University. So very warm welcome, Max, to you. Max, I remember that you joined us a few years ago at the PSA for a research project that you did for your now published book on government for the public good. And I already thought we had a very interesting conversation there. And I think some of those thoughts and that research is reflected in your chapter as well. You have written about the role of the state and the lessons we need to learn and unlearn. And I don't want to talk too much about your chapter, because you will do that yourself. I want to start with talking a little bit about yourself. You told me that you're committed, open-minded, and clear-sighted. And from the reading of your writing and how you contribute to the public discourse, I would certainly say that that is true. But you might want to explain a little bit what you mean by those three words.
Oh, well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for that introduction, Andrea, and welcome to everyone following this from home. Yeah, I mean, those are sort of aspirational ways to describe the work that I do. I guess committed in the sense that, you know, I care about what the outcomes are from research and thinking, not just doing it for its own sake. Clear-sighted in the sense that, you know, I feel like a lot of what I try to do, particularly in my work around inequality, but sometimes around the role of government, is just to get people to see things that are there in front of them, but which they manage not to notice a lot of the time. Like, you know, I don't think people appreciate just how much government affects our lives every single day, regulates, supports almost everything in the world around us. And yeah, and open-minded in the sense that, particularly at the moment, it's, you know, with the situation changing so rapidly, and the sudden health shock, social shock, economic shock, it's very hard to know what's in front of us and what we should be doing. And I really appreciated the chance to write this essay for the PSA, and I hope that everyone taking part in this webinar gets a chance to read it, and I'm very interested in people's thoughts. But I found it quite hard to write because we're operating in such a period of uncertainty that even putting something down on paper about the shape of things to come felt very provisional and uncertain in places.
Thank you. And for all of you, if you haven't checked out Max's website yet, there's lots of his writing, lots of his thinking available there, and I believe you can leave feedback there and contact Max, so please use that and check it out. But thanks for the brief introduction, Max. I think we should get to the really exciting part now, to the chapter that was difficult to write, and I totally hear you. Everything feels a little bit like work in progress at the moment. So give us a bit of an overview of your main thoughts, your main ideas, and yeah, the role of the state, I guess, before and after COVID.
Yeah, well, thanks, Andrea. I mean, it's a difficult one because, you know, it's always, governments are such complex, multifaceted things, trying to serve so many different purposes. It's always hard to sum up, you know, what they do or what they should do succinctly. But I guess as I've been thinking about it in recent days, around sort of various New Zealand cities, there are sort of old life insurance offices that you'll see. And a number of them have a phrase up on them which says amicus certa, I think, in amicus certus in re incerta, which means, sort of loosely speaking, a stable friend in unstable times. And I actually think that's a nice way to think about what government needs to be doing for us at the moment, because, you know, we're in a profoundly unstable moment, and governments have always been, in a sense, the ultimate risk manager. You know, the social welfare system, which is coming under unprecedented strain, is basically a way in which we all chip into a collective pot, you know, as a way of sort of contributing a buffer against risk, and then we draw on it when we need to. And so I guess, you know, one of the big things for me that the government needs to be doing now is to be a stable friend to people in unstable times. And I say that acknowledging that government often doesn't feel like a friend to people. It can feel very intrusive and oppressive, and certainly poor communities, Māori communities would say that. So this is very much an aspiration for the future. But yeah, so a stable friend in unstable times, and, you know, and I think that involves the government being more active than it has in the past, you know, being more on the front foot, seeking to do more things, being more confident. I think it involves it being more dynamic and being more resilient. And, you know, that's all pretty big picture stuff. I won't go over the whole essay because, you know, I really want to leave lots of time for your questions and for the audience questions. But I guess it's, I think it's a combination of picking up a lot of ideas that were there already, because very often, you know, the thinking's already been done. We don't have to reinvent everything. And I've taken a lot of inspiration from things like Kate Raworth's donut economics, you know, talking about a government that helps us arrive in sort of the safe space, the flesh of the donut, so we're not undershooting. We don't have a government that leaves us with inadequate human development, but we also don't have a government that allows environmental overreach. You know, so we're not in the whole of the donut, we're not outside the donut, we're in that safe space. And I think that's a good role for government. And again, that's about stability, you know, having a stable relationship with the climate, with the planet. It's also about harmony and ensuring human development. I'd also like to see government being, you know, like I said, dynamic and confident in its approach to these things and in its approach to creating wealth, but doing it sustainably. You know, we don't often talk about the role of government in creating wealth, but another thinker who I really admire, Mariana Mazzucato, talks about, you know, how state investment, state research and development has been at the core of the 12 technologies that our smartphones rely on. You know, GPS, the touch screen, the CPU, all these kinds of things are originally public sector technologies in some sense, you know, so is the internet. So we need states, you know, that are confident, that are active. I think, you know, the massive task in front of government right now is going to be redeployment, you know, tens of thousands of people losing their jobs. We need a government that's confident enough to say, we can deliver really high quality retraining programs that take people, look at what skills they have, look at what skills they need for the new economy we're going to have post-coronavirus, really invests in their retraining, helps them get those new jobs. And I also think we're going to need a government that's more resilient. You know, we're seeing incredible work done by our public sector workers, especially the people on the front line, who are often poorly paid, 2/3 of whom, of course, are women. They need to be better supported, but also, you know, we're seeing how stretched our health system is. I think the message that has to come through loud and clear is we need to invest in a resilient government. And that's a government that doesn't just operate on the bare bones all the time, but actually is invested in, that has spare capacity, that might occasionally look inefficient if you have a very narrow view of efficiency, but which actually has fat in the system, so that when we need a whole lot of extra contact tracers or ICU beds or whatever, they're already there. When we need protective equipment, it's already there and we're not running around and panicking. I could say a whole lot more things, but I think dynamic, active, resilient state, all in the service of being a stable friend in unstable times, is a really powerful motivating goal, I think, for government right now.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much in there already, and I will certainly ask a couple of questions before I invite our participants, our audience, to post questions in the question and answer function. I was just wondering, when you described what kind of state you are looking for in those character traits of an active and confident state, a dynamic and resilient state, how do you think the public sees the role of the state? And maybe a bit in comparison before COVID and now after. You mentioned the redeployment aspect. I think that, you know, that might have changed the view of the public quite significantly, or at least some parts of the public.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's also a very difficult one to answer. And one of the things I'm concerned about is there is a little bit of what I see as a slightly naive or optimistic discussion starting to emerge, with people saying, well, now that the government is doing all these things, it's obvious that there's this massive groundswell of support for government. And I really think it's much more complicated than that. It's absolutely true that trust in government on international surveys in the last week or so is at an an extraordinary high, and particularly in New Zealand. And that's justified, because I think government, certainly our government, has responded very well to the crisis, broadly speaking, although there's some criticisms that can be made, particularly around their insensitivity to Māori issues, I think. So there is high trust, but at the same time, the state is acting in an incredibly authoritarian way, and people's support for its continued sort of intrusion into our lives may diminish, may start to be resented. And you're coming off 30 or 40 years in which people have been told principally that the state was inefficient, as compared to markets, that governments don't know the right things to do, they don't know how to pick winners, they won't spend your money well, you can't trust politicians, all these kinds of things. And those attitudes aren't going to disappear overnight. So I see, unlike some other people, I don't see coronavirus necessarily as creating a massive break in people's views towards government. I think it's much more like, I think what Martin Luther King envisaged in that famous quote where he says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think coronavirus, people seeing government being more effective, more people relying on government for support, I think that opens the way for a couple of steps further down that path towards a better world where we have that better kind of government. But I don't think it suddenly opens the door to everything that people might have dreamed that government would do.
Thank you. While you were talking, I thought, the characteristics of that state and the view of the public with regards to the role of the state or government is just really important when you consider the well-being approach. I think it's very relevant to that, because it sort of enshrines what the view of this government is of itself and what it tries to do. And usually, or I would think, that the well-being approach should have deeply felt impacts for individuals and communities. And you just mentioned, for example, that the response to some of the Maori-related responses are not adequate enough. And I was wondering how a well-being approach, or how an adequate approach would look like that actually facilitates well-being, especially beyond the crisis, safety in the crisis and well-being beyond. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a really complex subject, and I think what the government has tried to do so far with its well-being agenda, I broadly agree with, because it's a holistic view of humanity. It says, for people to be genuinely well, to be flourishing, there's a huge range of things they need, and the government's you can pull together 40 indicators, across, do you feel safe in your community? Do you have the income you need? Are you safely housed? Are you in good health? All these kinds of things. So I think that's a step forward. I don't think we've really grappled with, well, what would it mean to actually look like to put that into practice? Because there are some really crucial things. I mean, economic inequality, for instance, is so terrible it limits the life chances of the poorest, for a start, but also a society where you have huge imbalances, disparities, divisions between people is a very dysfunctional one. It's a distrustful society. It's a dysfunctional society. It's one that lacks social cohesion. So how do you give inequality really strong prominence within a well-being framework is another big question. But yeah, I think what we're seeing in the crisis is that people are realizing how important public services are to their well-being, how important the work of frontline public sector workers is, or even essential workers in the private sector, like people who work in supermarkets, people who work in care homes. So that's useful. But yeah, I think we've also seen consistently throughout the response, Māori views brought in quite late into the picture, support for Māori communities being relatively small compared to, the support we've just seen announced for racing, for instance, the, restrictions on tangihanga, so which seem inconsistent with the fact that you know, sporting activities are suddenly going to become a lot easier. Even the debates today about, you know, do the new laws give warrantless access for the police to enter marae? I just think, you know, that's been pretty poorly done on its own merits. And yeah, if you have a broad view of well-being that includes, you know, the importance of Māori to autonomously decide, you know, their futures and their lives for themselves, it also fails in terms of well-being on those grounds, I think.
Mm. We have a question here on your views on fast-tracking consent, and I think that is a question that links more broadly to civic participation and the role of the public in actually decision-making of the state or of government. So in relation to this question, it's about environmental protection, and that actually links nicely to Kate Rayworth, who joined the Just Transition Summit last year in Taranaki, and was advocating for that balance that you were talking about, that she kind of named a donut economics, I suppose, where nobody is left behind, but where we are also not overstepping our boundaries. So these are two questions in one, really. One is about, I guess, competing demands between different policy areas, and the other one is how we can include participation of the public and make it a meaningful part within the role of the state.
Yeah, and again, fantastic questions. And it is very difficult because we're trying to balance different competing demands, which of course is what government always does. Yeah, I mean, and in my other writings, you know, I've argued that I think the future of government is much less top down, it's much more bottom up. It's participatory in the sense that it involves ordinary citizens much more heavily in the decisions that affect them. And it's deliberative in the sense that it draws on discussion amongst citizens to bring the best ideas to the surface. But it is a very difficult time because I do accept that there is some need for urgency. You know, we need to get the economy going again, not as an abstract concept, but because it's through economic activity that people generate income and support their communities and find meaning in their lives and just keep important things happening. So if you look about, you know, the decision to suspend the RMA for a couple of years effectively for major projects, on one level that's very troubling. You know, when you look at the environmental damage that's been done by big projects in the past, I also think that's probably a done deal. The government is going to do that. You know, there's not much to be gained in trying to fight that, I don't think, rightly or wrongly. I also think more generally on that point and on Raworth's donut economic type approach, and coming back on my point about this not being a rupture but a gradual progression, I'm comfortable with the idea that some of the immediate post-coronavirus projects are a little bit of the old normal, because it's very difficult to suddenly switch to a new way of doing things. And actually, you know, quite apart from the fact that we're in a state of emergency and normal democratic scrutiny has been drastically reduced. And so it'd be a very undemocratic time to change everything. A lot of people in this webinar will know that the public service is incredibly stretched and frankly is in no position, I think, to upturn everything and create an entirely new social and political settlement. So I'm relaxed about the idea that, for instance, we have some projects that are not that innovative in the short term. I'm more concerned about the medium term. We use the medium term to take these steps along the path, the moral arc of the universe towards justice, to come back to that Martin Luther King thing. So what are the medium term projects that are really in line with, you know, actually having a sustainable relationship with the planet? You know, I think that's where we really want to be building recycling facilities, investing massively in light rail, public transport, cycling and walking, all these other kinds of things that are sustainable in that sense. And also in the medium and long term, you know, limiting any of these sort of suspensions of consultation to the absolute minimum, and continuing to make the argument that the best kind of government is the kind of government that we see emerging overseas, that where you have participatory budgeting, you know, where citizens help directly set portions of their council budgets, or some modified Aotearoa specific form of citizens' assemblies where you're getting people to discuss and make decisions on core issues. I think these are all things we just have to nudge government in the right direction in the medium to long term, while accepting that the short term may look, you know, non-ideal in our terms.
And I guess that's very relevant for workplaces as well, to ensure that democratic participation, so that also workplaces or employers can take, or the state as the employer, can take a longer term view and be resilient and proactive in dealing with the challenges that are ahead of us, really.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'll just briefly add to that, you know, one of the concepts that's guided a lot of how workplaces operate, you know, from the top down, and our lives in general, is this sort of concept of economic efficiency. You know, always trying to drive things down to the lowest cost and run things on the absolute bare bones. And that's not crazy at all. I mean, that is something that helps things be delivered more efficiently. But it is also a model that leaves companies very, very exposed. You know, very, very lacking in resilience, I guess, and particularly not investing in their workforce, you know, even though that's the most important thing. And so I'd like to see, and this is less a policy and more of just a general cultural shift, one towards where we're building models across the board that are more resilient, you know, so more resilient communities, more resilient ecologies, so we're restoring the environment, but also more resilient workplaces where, you know, frankly, workers get a larger slice of company revenues, where they're more invested in, they're treated better, they're less stretched, they're not feeling as exploited. And just everybody's got a bit more fat in their system to respond to major crises like this one.
We actually have one question that touches on another very dear topic of yours, which is the funding of the state. How do we actually fund all those activities now and into the future? Can you say a little bit about that, especially given that, you know, people usually don't like to say pay higher taxes and are very skeptical about giving money to the state? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we're going to need, you know, major new sources of revenue. I think there's a couple of elements. You know, public debt is going to increase significantly. There's no doubt about that, but it will be manageable. And what's really important is we not get into a state of mind where we panic about public debt and think that there's something terrible about it and we have to slash services in order to pay it down. Elsewhere, I've used the example of the UK, which had public debt of 2.5 times its national income after World War II, but it paid it down slowly and sensibly, didn't make its last payment on its war debt until 2006. You know, and the debt we will have will be minuscule in comparison. So there'll be absolutely no need to panic about it. We can pay it off slowly and sensibly. And I also think there's a chance to rethink about, well, how do we pay for it? Because, you know, what have we seen in coronavirus? We have seen people coming together, both in a sort of a community sense and at a, you know, at the government level, in really inspiring ways. You know, people have supported each other, but we've also all undergone major sacrifices, you know, deprivation of our liberty, staying at home, for some people, frankly, loss of their job, loss of their business in the long run. We've made a collective sacrifice to ensure everybody else's health. And I think that's a really inspiring example. And we need to carry that forward and say, well, collectively, we, and a lot of it through government, have pulled ourselves back from the brink. You know, we're dealing with this incredibly threatening crisis. We can carry that forward. and government needs to be adequately funded to continue to support people, to be that stable friend in unstable times, and to ensure that we support people to come through this recovery well, that we continue to help each other in the most profound way we can, which is to say that we will guarantee the income, the living standards of people who are frankly total strangers to us, even if they live in the same country. And we all have to chip in, and we all have to support government in that collective rescue work. And so I think it opens the door to arguing for things like, you know, what even the IMF has taken to calling a solidarity surcharge, in effect, a tax, you know, on very high-end wealth from people who aren't badly affected by this crisis, you know, whose wealth will come through pretty much unscathed. It's absolutely fair that in order to support people who've lost their jobs and lost their businesses, the people who can most afford to can pay a bit more. And that is very much people who possess large amounts of wealth, which currently is untaxed or very lightly taxed in the system.
That reminds me actually of the Solidarity Fund in Germany that was created after Germany reunified with or reunified as such in order to support Eastern Germany. It was a similar concept, and you could argue it worked reasonably well in certain parts. It probably should have been higher, the amount, to really invest and become resilient, but it's certainly a very interesting concept, I believe. Max, we have so many questions coming now, so I don't know where to start. This is fabulous, lovely audience, thank you. I think we have a cluster of questions around the relationship between DHBs and the Ministry of Health, and what it might say or what it has exposed during COVID, and what it might say or suggest in terms of changes that are needed and that the government needs to undertake to actually instill that confidence again in people in terms of the health system and how it operates.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I'll be completely honest, I'm absolutely not an expert on the health system, and I don't know that I would be able to give people a very good steer on what needs to happen there. I guess I would just say that, you know, obviously the government's putting more money into the health system, and that's very welcome, and that's important. I do question whether all of that money is going to be spent well, because it does feel like our health system is not as functional as it could be. On the other hand, one of the things I know from my general research is that organizational change is incredibly destabilizing, you know, and that sort of mania we often have for restructuring government. My understanding is the research shows it can take staff in an organization up to 3 years to recover their previous productivity after a massive reorganization. So I'm a little bit nervous certainly about the idea of structural change in the health system. I mean, albeit it might be necessary. I mean, I do think this is probably a broader picture point. I mean, I do think we need rethinking of our health system. It's, you know, sort of very badly designed in the sense that the one thing that absolutely should be free, going to see your GP, is quite expensive, whereas going to A&E is free. And, you know, I mean, I think we need to think about having what other countries have, which is, you know, a free healthcare system, fundamentally free at the point of need, whether that's the NHS sort of tax-funded model, whether it's a social insurance model, because we have huge amounts of unmet health need. And, you know, at the moment, I see a real lack of vision in the health sector. I mean, what is the new vision? I mean, we could have a vision that's based around community care, that's based around care in the home, that's based around technology changing everything, that's based around, I know, substantial autonomy for Māori health providers, it's based around integration with whānau ora. Whatever it is, I don't see a vision at the moment coming out of the government for all those things, and that concerns me.
We have an interesting question here that relates the role of government to the economy. And the person is asking how this new state, this new government that you envisage, if it's actually possible to make it happen unless we have radical economic change. And that means basically throwing overboard our neoliberal kind of beliefs and agendas associated with it.
That's an interesting question and a difficult one to answer without taking up all the rest of the webinar. But it is a really, really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think there are, at the very least, very different varieties of social democracy or of capitalism. And this is maybe a banal point, but, you know, the Scandinavian states, you know, have not sort of completely torn up the rule book of Western states, but they look very different to us and they achieve very different results. You know, they have much lower levels of inequality and therefore much better levels of health. They're much more cohesive societies. They look after the poorest much better. They're more dynamic. They're more innovative. They create wealth better and they distribute it better. And albeit they're not as environmentally sustainable as they should be, they're better than other Western developed nations. So, I mean, and I would be very nervous about sort of tearing up the existing rule book without a very clear idea of where you were going and what would replace it. So I think, I mean, I'm not saying that I think Scandinavia is perfect, but I think some kind of 21st century version of social democracy that has at its heart a really confident, active state, you know, that does all that stuff that Mariana Mazzucato talks about. It's the entrepreneurial state. It's a state that sees itself as a wealth creator, a creator of markets, a state that picks big missions, you know, like to talk about Germany again. In the 1990s, Germany said, we're going to create a market in renewable energy, basically. The state is going to be the funder of this market. And that brought down the price of solar and wind colossally. And we are now all riding on the coattails of that German government decision that that was its mission and that was what it was going to pursue. So I'd want a 21st century social democratic state that's, you know, it's deliberative and participatory. It does all those things. It's confident, it's active and dynamic. But I think that's a profound transformation from where we are now. I don't think you have to tear up everything about the current system.
Thank you. You might have heard that we have a question here around the universal basic income, and you might have heard that Finland has just released its report on an experiment they have run for a couple of years on the universal, on actually implementing a universal basic income. And the question here is, again, related directly to COVID, since we will see many people unemployed without income or without enough income stability. Do you think a universal basic income would help in this situation? Would it be worthwhile testing it? And personally, I would also like to hear your ideas on another concept in those discussions, which are the universal basic services, which would ensure something like a universal social wage, if you like, because certain basic services, such as, for example, childcare would be made, or transport would be made available for free for those who actually need it. So do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I think the universal basic income is a useful challenge to our current welfare system, which is very complex and often very demeaning. I've talked about this in the past. I wrote a Stuff article about a month ago on it, and I've been interviewed for the RNZ The Detail podcast, which will be out next week on the UBI. I fundamentally don't think the UBI works. And the problem is that basically, in order to, it can never escape from the trap that to make it generous enough to actually deliver the amount of support that's needed, it's unaffordable. And if you set it at an affordable rate, it's just far too low to be any use. I can't go through all the calculations now, but just to really sketch them out, if you certainly can't afford to pay it at the rate of New Zealand Super at $22,000 a year, you'd have to double the government's budget overnight, completely impossible. If you paid it at the rate of the unemployment benefit, that's about $13,000 a year. But even after savings, that would cost over $30 billion, huge amount, I think politically unobtainable. There are much higher demands for that, as you say, in something like universal basic services, or just building lots of public houses, fixing our creaking water system, funding mental health properly, all these things. Even if you set that aside, the universal basic income at that rate wouldn't necessarily increase the income of a single person on the unemployment benefit, i.e. the person that most needs to help. So you would have spent $30 billion, a truly extraordinary amount of money, along the way paying $13,000 a year to millionaires without necessarily helping the people you most need to help. And that is just, for all the good intentions and all the other advantages that a UBI might have, that is a truly dreadful way to spend money. And what would be much better is, I mean, Australia's just doubled its core benefit temporarily as a COVID response. We could do that here for a couple of $2 billion, i.e. an absolute fraction of the UBI, and that would have a transformative effect on the poorest New Zealanders. And you could make the benefit unconditional, so they don't have to jump through lots of hoops. They just get it clawed back slowly and gradually as they earn more income. And at that point, you'd probably call it a guaranteed minimum income, which I think is a much more promising three-letter acronym. And that's true even, well, it's particularly true with high unemployment post-coronavirus, because if you've got high unemployment, you've still got lots of people who are fine. And so paying them money is not what you need to do. If you've got more people who are in danger of falling into really dire straits, you need to give them an amount of money, a much more generous benefit that would allow them to live in dignity. So the current crisis actually strengthens the case for a guaranteed minimum income. It doesn't at all strengthen the case for a UBI.
Thank you. Max, we are close to the time up. I would love to continue, as you can see here, but we nearly have talked for 45 minutes. But before, I would like to thank you and the audience. I really want to chuck in this one question, which is about your title, Learning and Unlearning Lessons. Maybe that's a good way of finishing. Tell us what we need to learn and which lessons we need to unlearn.
Well, I guess it's just a question of, it's again my point that you can't assume that coronavirus is suddenly this great rupture, that everything is going to change. I've always said why I don't think that's true. I also think, a lot of people are just going through a lot of pain and disruption and will cling to the old normal, and that's really understandable. So rather than assuming that everything changes, we have to think very carefully about what the crisis actually justifies and doesn't justify. And the short-term responses have to be very closely connected to what's actually going on right now. And I don't think we should introduce the big transformative change until we're out of a state of emergency, until the normal scrutiny has resumed. But so I think there are lessons that we need to unlearn in certain sense of, getting away from some of those myths about the ineffective or non-entrepreneurial state of the past. I think there are lessons we need to not learn from the crisis. One of the aspects of the government's response is that it has been very authoritarian, and that's been necessary because it's been an emergency. But we can't take from that the lesson that authoritarian governments are in general highly effective, because the evidence shows that they are on average not. And of course, they deeply interfere with people's liberties. So that's a lesson that we shouldn't learn. But I think I would just come back to my core point that what is the lesson we are learning is that people have suddenly realized just how much they rely on government. And what we need to say is that that's not just a lesson for a crisis, that's a lesson for all time. Government is always, you know, there as the bedrock, the ultimate risk manager. And we do need to learn that lesson, that it is, you know, the best possible source of a potential stable friend in these very unstable times that we're in. Fantastic.
What a closing word. Thank you so much, Max. I mean, this was just hugely interesting and also inspiring, and definitely will continue to inspire the work of the PSA, but also of the public.
Can I just say that really appreciate, there's so many questions we obviously haven't been able to get to. If there's any way that I can answer those questions and sort of get the responses back to people post the webinar, I'll be very happy to have a go at doing that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was such a flood of questions, and my apologies to everyone where I couldn't pick up your question. But we will try to get them to you. I think we have answered some last time on Facebook as well, so we will find a way to get those questions answered as well. But yeah, first of all, you might all want to read Max's essay, which I said at the beginning you can find on our website, but also on Facebook. And surely you want to check out Max's website as well, where you find heaps more of information. Of course, last but not least, if you enjoyed this webinar, please share it on your social media as well. Share it with your friends and invite friends along. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time. And that will be the 28th of May, and we are going to talk to Troy Basin, who is talking about restoring research for the restoration of well-being. So that surely will be a really interesting webinar as well. And that really leaves me with thanking you all for participating. Share your ideas and inspirations with your colleagues, with your friends. And I will say thank you and stay well.
Thank you.